The Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development will come to order. I note that the quorum is present. Without objections, the chair is recognized to call a recess at any time. Also welcome the committee members who are not members of the subcommittee and are wavering onto this process. Welcome them for today's hearing. Today's hearing addresses a long-growing cancer that resides in the hearts of American academic institutions. Unfortunately, it is spread through our foundational institutions in the whole of Western liberal society. It's called diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI for short. Most Americans over the last 2 or 3 years have heard the term DEI, but may not know exactly what it is. There's no better way to describe it than to quote from one of DEI's most famous proponents, Ibram X. Kendi, and I quote, "The remedy of racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination." I can summarize this definition in 2 words, demeaning and racist. Demeaning due to the total lack of intellectual or moral common sense, racist because anyone who accepts this irrational mindset is guaranteed to become a bigot. There are only 2 areas of measurement in which I believe DEI can be considered roundly successful. It is an industry that has created multimillionaires from previously unknown and non-peer respected authors. It is also an industry that has successfully steered hundreds of thousands of our youth away from the visions of our founding fathers. That vision was one of becoming a more perfect union, one in which the citizenry improves with each generation to judge each other based on our content of character, not by race, creed, or color. The Marxist-centered DEI, on the other hand, has a jaded view of America and Americans. It views our nation as a pyramid composed of race oppressors and race oppressed. It attributes all of America's societal ills and flaws to the white Judeo-Christian male. To remedy all past perceived racism and injustice perpetrated by this sect of Americans, DEI prescribes a healthy injection of black racism and black injustice. DEI bureaucrats are hired not only to control conversations, but also to stifle free speech and open discourse by asserting leverage on every aspect of university management, personnel, curriculum, policy, and college admissions. It proceeds to attack the foundational pillars of academic freedom. DEI is not an abstract concept. It is instead practical applications used in almost every college campus throughout our country, both public and private. It is seen as universities use race as a plus factor in admissions. Instead of intellectual competition and meritocracy, it is skin color that is deemed the winner or loser, pitting races against each other. The impact of DEI is seen in indoctrination of students as they undergo mandatory racial bias education. Based on their race, each student is deemed an irredeemable oppressor or a member of the hapless, hopeless, and weak oppressed. To my Jewish friends, if you wonder about the surprising outgrowth of anti-Semitism now raging on our college campuses, this is the genesis. DEI teaches that at the very top of the oppressor pyramid is the Jewish race. There's no empathy in the DEI space once identified as an oppressor, only disdain. At the core of DEI is also the soft bigotry of low expectation. It teaches Black Americans as members of the oppressed race we're weak and incapable of standing and succeeding independently, that we must wait for the success wand to be waved over us by white Americans. Or even better, we should wait for the promise of slavery reparation. DEI purports that Black Americans like myself, who can muster the tenacity and grit to succeed, are the exception, not the rule. Once again, DEI is both demeaning and racist. DEI is also heartless and unforgiving. Scholars who dare to publish research that challenges the liberal orthodoxy are often canceled or pushed out of the academic profession. For professors who love teaching and seek to earn a tenure, they are forced to take a loyalty oath in which they either promise to adhere to the principles of DEI or find another profession. The DEI movement is at its core divisive. It judges others based on our immutable characteristics like color, race, and past industry, which we have no control of. Instead of becoming a more perfect union, it turns our schools, communities, cities into cesspools of divisiveness, hate, and intolerance. I look forward to the discussion on DEI today, from its Marxist roots to the modern-day DEI industry that siphons millions of dollars from education and workforce budgets. For those who want to know how much it costs us across the country, I have just a few examples here. According to College Fix, University of Michigan, $30 million a year. Texas A&M University, $11 million. Ohio State University, $20 million. University of West Wisconsin, $16 million. And what is the result? More hatred, more anger, and more racism. So I'm looking forward to addressing this. And I want to thank everybody again for joining us. And I want to yield now to the ranking member for her closing statement, or opening statements.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Once again, instead of having a productive conversation about addressing students' mental health needs, ending campus hunger, protecting students' civil rights, committee Republicans have determined it would be a better use of our time to malign campus diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs. Mr. Chairman, I'm still processing that you were trying to equate this with cancer, which to me is baffling and pretty offensive to anyone who's had cancer. As population grows and access to higher education expands, college campuses are becoming more reflective of our society. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, white students accounted for nearly 80% of college undergraduates in 1980 and 54% in 2020. Hispanic and Latino students increased from 4% of the undergraduate population in 1980 to slightly more than 20% in 2020. Thanks to Title VI and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, campuses are more accessible to women, to other racial groups, as well as students who identify as LGBTQI+, international students, students with disabilities. And although this is to be celebrated, increases in campus population are not necessarily indicative of changed attitudes or closely held beliefs. In 2020, the U.S. saw 517 reported hate crime instances on college campuses, with more than half of them motivated by race, and these are only the reported incidents. Discrimination is also not limited to race. Socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and even disabilities. Students face discrimination based on their religion as well. And this is why DEI programs exist. No two programs are alike, but DEI offices exist to address student needs, to give strategic support to faculty, to institutional leaders, to identify hurdles and assist faculty and staff in serving, educating, and meeting the needs of increasingly diverse populations, many of whom are first-generation college students. Regrettably, some Republican-led state legislatures have decided that DEI offices are too costly, and yet these programs barely affect many university budgets. As a result of this legislation, significant cuts have been made to DEI programs. For example, in 2023, Wisconsin State Legislature proposed cutting 188 DEI jobs from the University of Wisconsin's 13-campus system for a total of $32 million, but the DEI employees account for less than 1% of the overall number of UW employees, and they are employees that the university determined were important to hire. Last week, the University of Florida fired 13 DEI officials out of its 19,000 employees in accordance with an anti-DEI initiative championed by Governor DeSantis. Now, I'm sure our colleagues will be able to provide some one-off examples or anecdotes of instances at school where DEI programming is not fully living up to its mission and not making all students feel safe and welcome on campus. To the extent that that is occurring at schools, by all means, we should challenge their DEI programs to improve and change, but that's not a reason to end the DEI programs entirely. Rather than condemning programs that are attempting to rectify inequities, this committee should be focused more on the root causes that lead to inequities in the first place. So thank you, witnesses, for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much. I just want to make a quick comment. All due respect, I am a cancer survivor. And so when I equate DEI to cancer, it is the real deal. It is a cancer to the soul of our nation, as will be seen as we talk through this process today. I'm so thankful again that we have an opportunity to bring this to the Americans' attention. So that being said, pursuant to Committee Rules 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. 14 days after this hearing, which is March 21st, 2023. Without objections, the hearing records will remain open for 14 days to allow statements and other materials referenced during this hearing to be submitted for the official record hearing. I now turn to the introduction of our 4 distinguished witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Erec Smith, who is Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania and a Cato Research Fellow. He's located in York, Pennsylvania. Our next witness is Dr. James Murphy, who is Director of Career Pathways and Post-Secondary Policy at Education Reform Now, located in Washington, D.C. Our third witness is Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, who is Chair of the Do Not Harm and is located in Barmere, Pennsylvania. And our final witness is Dr. Jay Greene, who is a Senior Research Fellow at Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policies and is located in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I want to thank the witness for being here today. And pursuant to committee rules, I would ask that you each limit your oral presentation to 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I will first recognize Dr. Smith.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. Chairman Owens, ranking and distinguished members of the Higher Education and Workforce Subcommittee, my name is Erec Smith, and I am a research fellow at the Cato Institute. Thank you for giving me a platform to speak on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. I have been faculty, I have been a writing program administrator, I have even been a diversity officer. Contemporary DEI is built upon a foundation whose very mission is to perpetuate racism. Contemporary DEI is not an extension of the civil rights movement. It is undergirded by a quasi-Marxist ideology called critical social justice. The salient tenet of critical social justice is this: the question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in this situation? So, according to critical social justice, racism is always already taking place. There is no need to think for oneself. The narrative, one of perpetual oppression, does the thinking for you. Another underlying concept of critical social justice is prescriptive racism, the prescribing of certain values, attitudes, and behaviors onto someone based on race. To shirk these values, attitudes, and behaviors is to be inauthentic, to not be a true member of a particular racial group. Questioning of this ideology is considered a form of racism. I have many stories to tell, but I will share one, maybe two, that illustrate these concepts and the general absurdity of critical social justice-backed DEI. A prominent figure in my field, which is rhetoric and composition, wrote a mass email requesting that people boycott an academic organization because he and others experienced racism during a committee meeting. However, neither he nor anyone else would actually explain what happened. I wasn't going to boycott an influential organization based on incomplete information, so I asked a simple question: what happened? For this, I was vilified by my colleagues, and colleagues of all colors, and accused of perpetuating white supremacy. Merely asking the question, what happened, was considered a form of racism. You see here that an accusation of racism cannot be questioned. Remember, the question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? Another story involves two professors who always allow their Black students to write in Black vernacular, African-American vernacular, some people say Ebonics. However, the students' refusal to do so, because they were there to learn standard English, was seen by the professors as a form of self-hatred and internalized racism. A prominent figure in the field, one who is self-proclaimed as a Marxist, went as far as to say these students were being selfish and immature, his words, for wanting to write in standardized English, because that would just perpetuate the status quo of whiteness. As Black students who wanted to write in standard English, they shirked the attitudes and values these professors prescribed to them as Black students. Their desire to write in a standard English was treated like a kind of pathology. Whenever I hear stories like this, I always say the same thing to myself. Thank God these were my professors when I was in college. I would be steeped in negative emotionality and learned helplessness. If I had hopes and dreams, I would not have the courage to chase them. I know some people out there are trying to do DEI in a way that does not assume racism at all times, does not prescribe behavior based on race, and does not shirk critical thinking to abide by a narrative. But those doing DEI undergirded by critical social justice, and there are many, are not fighting racism. They are perpetuating racism. I don't know if you've all noticed yet, but I'm Black. And I'm against this DEI. Why? Because I really like being Black. And this ideology is infantilizing, it's anti-intellectual, and since I am a mature intellectual person, it doesn't align with me. I am too good for contemporary DEI, and so are many others. I hope we can have a good conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Now I'd like to recognize Dr. Murphy.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Bonamici, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs today and the valuable contribution they make to institutions of higher education and the students who attend them. My name is James Murphy, and I'm the Director of Post-Secondary Policy at Education Reform Now, where I work on, among other things, improving college access for underrepresented students. It's an honor to be given the opportunity to clear up some myths about DEI and to talk about some of the actual work that DEI staff members do. I should be clear that I have never worked in a DEI office, and my comments today are based on research, facts, and conversations with people who work in the field. It's an approach I strongly recommend. DEI offices may feel new or confusing to some, but they're a natural development of the need to serve the changing demographics of higher education going back to the 1960s. As time went by, ad hoc practices became more formalized and professionalized. But even as that happened, DEI never cohered into a monolithic institution built around an ideological consensus. Any attempt to define the real impact of DEI must begin with an acknowledgement that there are hundreds of colleges and universities that employ staff working to make their campuses more welcoming, fair, and inclusive. Unsurprisingly, one finds considerable variation in the scope, mission, practices, and authority of those offices. That alone should give us pause in speaking about DEI as if it were a single thing, let alone an ideology, and remind us to be very, very careful not to let anecdotes masquerade as analysis. At some institutions, DEI work is carried out by fostering community engagement and dialogue. At others, it entails the creation and transmission of guidance or recommendations on putting fairness and diversity at the center of a range of practices, from admissions and instruction to recruitment and hiring. At some institutions, DEI offices play a central role, a role demanded by law in ensuring that their college is in compliance with Title VI, Title IX, and the Americans with Disability Act. What few, if any, DEI offices actually do is provide direct instruction to students, let alone indoctrinate them into any set of beliefs. As Mitchell Chang, interim chief diversity officer at UCLA, recently wrote, chief diversity officers spend their days on administrative duties and functions, not advocating their own political views. If anyone is trying to tell students what to think, it is legislators who want to ban these offices wholesale or write bills to make it illegal for university employees to say phrases like unconscious bias or cultural appropriation. College, we're all doctors here, is for debating ideas. It's not for protecting students from words. So I want to spend the remainder of my time talking about a few words. Let's start with diversity. The educational benefits of campus diversity include the following: training future leaders, preparing graduates to adapt to an increasingly pluralistic society, promoting the robust exchange of ideas, and producing new knowledge stemming from diverse outlooks. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that list, and he called those benefits, I quote, commendable goals and plainly worthy in the majority opinion in the Students for Fair Admissions decision last June, a decision I didn't agree with, but was glad to see the Chief Justice call out the importance of diversity on campus. When I think of diversity, I'm reminded of of a conversation I had years ago with a friend, a lifelong Republican, by the way. He had just graduated from West Point, or he had graduated from West Point, and after serving in the Gulf War, he had earned an MBA at Emory University, just completed it. When I asked him skeptically, what on earth could a business school teach him about leadership after he'd led a combat unit in Iraq? He told me that getting an MBA was incredibly useful for him because it was the first time he'd ever worked with women in his life. That's the value of diversity. Learning with people who come from different racial, ethnic, religious, and ideological backgrounds not only lets us all share in the richness of the American experience, but also prepares today's young people for the 21st century workplace. Let's talk about equity, a much used word, very little understood. Here's what it does not mean. Equity does not mean pursuing equality of outcomes. That's a ridiculous idea that's been repeatedly cited by opponents of DEI offices. No one can promise equal outcomes. Equity is about equality of opportunity and fairness. Equity does not mean treating everyone like they're the same. It means treating everyone with the same level of respect and dignity. Which brings us to inclusion. When DEI staff talk about inclusion, they're talking about removing unnecessary and unfair barriers to success on campus for students of color, for students with disabilities, for veterans, for returning students with children, for a range of students. We all perform at a higher level after all, and we feel like we're working in an environment that values us for who we are and treats us all fairly. That means things like providing winter jackets to students with Pell Grants who come from the South. That means providing avenues for students from a rural background or students of color to meet with other students of a similar background. Or it might mean helping professors to identify their own biases in faculty hiring. I'll close by saying that the current wave of attacks on DEI offices should be understood for what they are: excessive, divisive, ideological assaults on some of the basic principles of our democracy and of academic freedom. I'm confident they'll ultimately prove to be ineffective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. I'd like to recognize Dr. Goldfarb.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Bonavici, and members of the committee for the invitation to address this committee. My name is Stanley Goldfarb. I'm a board-certified nephrologist, former Associate Dean of Curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, and chair of the medical nonprofit Do No Harm. I have practiced medicine for over 50 years, and I care deeply about the state of American medicine. My message today is simple. DEI is dangerous everywhere, but it's most dangerous in medical school. Americans need to know exactly what's happening. Your future doctors are learning about divisive politics at the expense of life-saving care. They're being taught to discriminate by race, not treat patients equally. Ultimately, your future doctor is being trained to be an activist. But you don't need an activist when you're sick or suffering from a life-threatening disease. You need a doctor. And if we don't restore medical school to its real mission, Americans will inevitably suffer a diminished quality of health care. I've had a front row seat to the corruption of medical education. Precious classroom and clinical time is now devoted to issues such as climate change, homelessness, policing, and other social issues that doctors cannot change. The ideologues behind this trend know it, but they don't care. They want doctors who will march into hearing rooms like this one to support political causes. They don't want doctors, they want lobbyists in white coats. Consider what every medical student is now required to learn. The Association of American Medical Colleges, which effectively controls medical education, now forces medical schools to teach intersectionality, oppression, colonization, and white supremacy, among other core DEI topics. These aren't throwaway lines in a one-day seminar. They infuse everything from the first year of medical school to the last year of residency. Yet every minute students spend on colonialism is one they don't spend on cancer. When they study global warming, they don't study geriatric care. One medical student recently told my organization, "I've learned more about pronouns than I have about how the kidney functions." Patients should be concerned. DEI dominates far beyond the classroom. The Association of American Medical Colleges has compiled a list of 89 DEI policies that it wants to see at medical schools. Through Freedom of Information requests, my organization has found that most have implemented at least 81% of these demands. Many are close to 100%. For instance, medical schools routinely demand that faculty and staff sign DEI loyalty oaths. The goal is to weed out anyone who opposes DEI. To see where that leads, look at Washington University's medical school, where a lecturer threatens students not to debate her on critical race theory. This is the essence of compelled speech. Medical schools are lowering admission standards in the name of diversity, too. Some have abandoned requiring the MCAT for all applicants, even though the MCAT is the best predictor of a student's ability to become a doctor. By recruiting less qualified students, medical schools are producing less qualified physicians. And medical schools openly discriminate by race. We found numerous medical scholarships and fellowships that bar white and Asian students from applying. And we recently blew the whistle on UCLA medical schools requiring students to segregate by race. Nationwide, schools are dividing students into race-based classes and groups. They're violating federal civil rights laws, and they don't care unless called out. Worst of all, medical schools now support the resegregation of healthcare itself. DEI holds that patients should see physicians with the same skin color. Over 60 studies have shown that segregated medicine has no benefits, yet medical schools are pushing it anyway. Everything I've described is happening in red and blue state medical schools alike, Missouri, South Carolina, and Indiana as well. Medical students deserve better. Having educated thousands, I know that young people become doctors because they want to save lives. They deserve an education that empowers them, not indoctrination that corrupts them. Most of all, patients deserve better. They need doctors who will treat their illnesses and cure their diseases, not discriminate by race and advocate for divisive political demands. DEI puts Americans' lives at risk. The best way to save lives is to get DEI out of medicine now. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and hope to see congressional action in the days ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Goldfarb. Appreciate that. And last but not least, I would like to recognize Dr. Greene.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, for inviting me to address this committee. My name is Jay Greene. I am a Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Before joining Heritage, I was Distinguished Professor of Education Policy at the University of Arkansas. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, may sound like a set of benign values. But in practice, DEI bureaucracies advance a worldview that undermines diversity, promotes exclusion, and opposes the equal treatment of individuals based on merit. These DEI bureaucracies have grown quite large and powerful. In a recent report, my co-author James Paul and I analyzed the number of DEI staff at 65 universities that were members of the Power 5 athletic conferences. We found that the average university had 45 DEI bureaucrats, or more than one for every 33 tenure-track faculty members. DEI bureaucrats are not professors engaged in the primary academic functions of teaching or research. Instead, they articulate and enforce an ideological orthodoxy on contested matters of race and sex. Rather than foster inquiry and debate in search of the truth, as universities have traditionally done, DEI bureaucracies are designed to stifle inquiry and end debate with the ostensible purpose of protecting marginalized populations. As the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education describes their own goals, they seek to build, quote, a system of shared beliefs, values, norms, habits, and assumptions to advance EDI efforts. Bureaucratically enforced ideological orthodoxies like these shared beliefs may be desirable for religious organizations or political parties, but they are not appropriate for universities. Even worse, the radicalism of DEI orthodoxies make them more like those of cults than religious organizations, or more like revolutionary movements than those of political parties. DEI orthodoxies are informed by critical race theory and tend to divide people into oppressor and oppressed categories based on their group identities. According to this worldview, oppressors deserve to have their privilege taken away, while the oppressed deserve restitution for collective or historic wrongs. Justifying unequal treatment based on group identity can yield horrific results. We've particularly seen this in the recent spike of anti-Semitism on college campuses. If classification of a group as oppressor or oppressed is determined by its over or underrepresentation, the relatively high rate of Jews in universities supports their classification as oppressors. This is then used to justify imposing limits on opportunities for Jews in the name of equity. And harsh treatment of Jews can be justified as stripping them of privilege. Protesters on college campuses chanting anti-Semitic slogans are not just using the language promoted by DEI. We have also unfortunately seen DEI officials actively involved in promoting hatred toward Jews. Their professional commitment to inclusion apparently does not extend to Jews. These are not isolated incidents. James Paul and I analyzed the Twitter accounts of 741 university DEI staff to gauge their attitudes toward Israel and, for comparison, toward China. We found that university DEI staff are obsessed with Israel and display such vehement hostility toward the Jewish state that it clearly crosses the line into serious anti-Semitism. DEI staff tweet almost 3 times as often about Israel as they do about China. When DEI staff tweet about Israel, 96% of those tweets were critical of the Jewish state, while 62% of their tweets regarding China were actually favorable toward that communist country. This obsessive hatred toward Israel was evident not only in the disproportionate hostility DEI staff displayed toward Israel, but also in the excessive language typically used to criticize the Jewish state. DEI staff often used terms like apartheid, colonialism, genocide, and ethnic cleansing when discussing Israel. DEI has not only exacerbated hostility towards Jews, it has also generally inflamed racial tensions on campus. According to surveys administered at several universities, students report that campus climate is worse at universities with larger DEI bureaucracies. For example, the students at the University of Michigan with 163 DEI staff report being less satisfied with campus climate than those at Mississippi State with only 12 DEI staff. Compliance with the civil rights obligations of universities can be done without gigantic DEI bureaucracies. Given that DEI has no legitimate purpose and serves to inflame intergroup tensions, we need to dismantle it. At a minimum, we need to starve universities of the funds that they use to build DEI bureaucracies. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. Appreciate that. Under Committee Rule 9, we'll now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule, and I will begin the process. Dr. Goldfarb, 1 year ago, an article caught my attention that showed that new dimensions of critical race theory and DEI had not yet been seen. Columbia University received instant backlash when a video surfaced from 2021 showing medical students reciting an altered version of the Hippocratic Oath during a white coat ceremony. In the video, students chanted, "We also recognize the acts and the systems of oppression effected in the name of medicine. We take this oath of service to begin building a future guarded in truth, restoration, equity, and to fill medicine's capacity to liberate." Dr. Goldfarb, this Hippocratic Oath is a foundational statement for every student. Am I correct on that, as they take this, as they begin this journey?
Yes, that's correct.
Is there anything about the standard oath that has mentioned systems of oppressed in medicine before now?
No, sir.
It is an important part of the education is to learn about medicine to liberate?
No, sir.
I think this is interesting, and just a little bit quick background. I majored in marine and biology and chemistry. My last course that I ever took, the hardest of my life, was something called organic chemistry. I did a pass-fail because I wanted to not get a grade on that one. But in the end of the day, what I realized was those who truly mastered it were able to predict certain things. There's a math that's very predictable. There's a science based on God's laws that's very predictable. This is hypothetical, but as a physician, do you think that at some point, if patients are seriously injured or dies due to this practice of DEI liberation sciences instead of clinical science, that there will be a possibility of malpractice lawsuits, not only for the physician or the med schools that train them?
Yes, so that is quite hypothetical, and I'm certainly beyond my ken. I do think that it's really important that it be viewed as a profoundly academic activity, medical school, and that the treatment of patients is really an academic activity that, as you say, Physicians must keep a lot of information in their heads, sort through it, understand human variability, and be able to apply it to that individual patient with that individual patient's problems. And that is a very academic kind of activity. And that's why I feel so strongly that it's academic achievement that ought to be the basis for acceptance into medical school and for the ability physicians to, for applicants to become physicians. It really is a profoundly intellectual process that really needs to be done in the best way possible for the patient's well-being.
I think we can all agree that this is one profession that meritocracy should be the primary focus. And I will say this, advice to any personal injury lawyers that are listening in, please pay attention to words like DEI and medicine if they're ever in the same sentence, same paragraph, or the same book when it comes to medicine. I think you might have a good profession moving if that's the case. Dr. Greene, first of all, I appreciate your comments about the oppressor and oppressed. Help me understand, just can repeat real quickly the impact it's having on the Jewish community that we're now beginning to see across the country when you have this idea or this indoctrination that there is a race that is truly oppressor of everybody else.
Well, thank you for the question. Once we deviate from the principle that we're going to treat everyone equally as individuals and start treating people differently based on their group identification, it's then a question of which group do the Jews get placed in? Are they placed in the group of oppressors or oppressed? And the determination of which group people are placed in is largely based on their over or underrepresentation. So any group that's considered overrepresented is considered an oppressor. Any group considered underrepresented is considered oppressed. Jews, because they have thrived despite oppression, are overrepresented in many of these instances and therefore are treated roughly as oppressors. And it's an intellectual justification of their rough treatment in academic environments.
Okay, thanks. And Dr. Smith, real quickly, I read something you said here. DEI is harmful to the very people it claims to help. It stifles agency, and it is decidedly anti-Black. As a Black academic, I've been called a white supremacist by whites and blacks alike. By the way, welcome to the crowd. I've been called a KKK member by the Salt Lake Trib in utah, believe it or not, for trying to empower Black students. Can you expound on that a little bit? The last few seconds that we have.
Yes, I can. And that speaks to prescriptive racism, something I talked about during my original testimony. Prescriptive racism basically says that there is a list of characteristics that you have to abide by if you are going to be an authentic member of a group. Let's say Black Americans. If you don't abide by that script, then you are called inauthentically Black. I had the misfortune of hearing a keynote address at a conference a few years ago that really started this journey. The speaker had the argument that it was inherently racist.
We have to kind of wrap it up because we have just that's the last few seconds, if you can tie it down.
Oh, okay. It is not inherently racist to teach standardized English.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to turn over to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm disappointed to see that DEI programs are the newest target in my Republican colleagues' politicized culture war. And Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful that you were able to overcome cancer. I'm just baffled to think that a program that's intended to help students would be equated with such a dreadful disease. Diversity, equity, and inclusion offices at colleges and universities are intended to support and encourage students from all backgrounds and help them to be and stay safe as they come together on campus to learn and grow. Certainly we could have and should have a conversation about how these offices could better serve their students, but villainizing the entire concept and the dedicated individuals who are doing this work to advance a political narrative, which feels like is happening today, is an unacceptable use of our time here. We've been told that DEI offices are malevolent bureaucracies intent on indoctrinating students in controversial political ideologies. Dr. Murphy, what are the actual functions that DEI offices perform, and why are they so important for college students' academic success?
Thank you for the question. It's almost hard for me to say what the actual functions are that DEI offices perform because there's such variety in the field, right? So I alluded to one of the functions at sort of in the UC system. Most of the equity, the DEI offices there handle compliance, right? So they are required by law to exist. And so they are making sure that the university is in compliance with Title VI, Title IX, and the Americans with Disability Act. They make sure that students who feel threatened or have been threatened, both based on race, color, religion, importantly, disability, have recourse, right? Have essentially an office they can go to make, to file a complaint. It's an important part of some DEI work. That's not true at all institutions. At some institutions, it's a much smaller unit at the university, and they will handle things like freshman orientations, right? Recruitment practices in admissions offices, creating affinity groups. And it's not that affinity groups are all race-based affinity groups. Like an important affinity group on many campuses, a growing one, is first-generation low-income students, right? Very often that is through the DEI office because these students often feel isolated on campus. They are not showing up with a cohort of their friends from Harvard-Westlake. They're showing up as the only kid in their school to ever go to a place like this. So they perform a range of functions, which makes the attack on them, sort of nonsensical.
And Dr. Murphy, are DEI programs a threat to the civil rights of students on college campuses? And are there issues that are real threats to the civil rights of students on campuses?
DEI offices, it's hard for me again to say, are DEI offices a threat? No. Could it be possible that somebody working in a DEI office does something that is illegal or wrong? Yes, the same is true in the medical school, the same is true in the rhetoric department. If some individual or an individual department is in violation of the law, then yes, indeed, that person should face the consequences. No, the more realistic threats to civil rights on campus is shutting down students' voices, right? Shutting down faculty who are trying to serve them.
Right, and I absolutely agree with that. I want to urge my Republican colleagues to consider constructive ways that we as policymakers can protect students from discrimination and hostile learning environments, and that includes students who have been victims of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And we have had several discussions about that, and I wish we were working together to find a way to address that in a constructive way. Specifically, we should be focusing on increasing funding for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, because as we know, they have the responsibility to enforce the law. They investigate and intervene in instances of discrimination, and I want to note that we should all be standing together against the 25% proposed cut to the Office of Civil Rights budget, and instead provide the office with the funding they need to protect and serve our nation's students. And we should reject political narratives that focus more on stoking culture wars and assuring students' success and safety. And Dr. Murphy, you're talking about how DEI programs are different on different campuses. Why is that? And shouldn't those colleges be able and universities be able to design their own DEI programs and not have the government telling them what their DEI program should look like?
Yeah, they're different for the same reason that English departments are different from campus to campus. They're different for the reason that student services are different from campus to campus. Sometimes I find myself annoyed with the autonomy that we give to universities, and I wish I could have all the universities behave in a way that I would like them to, but that's not how we've designed American education. Our higher education system is the best in the world, in part because we grant universities the autonomy to determine what is the best way to deliver a powerful, strong, transformative education to students. So yeah, that is essentially the source of the difference.
And would there be a logical reason, Dr. Murphy, why the DEI office at, say, for example, the University of Michigan might look different from the DEI office at the University of Mississippi?
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean, a whole source of reasons. One would be state funding, right? So how much money does an institution have? Who are the students they serve is a crucial question, of course, here. What are the priorities of administration? I mean, and looking simply at the size of the faculty doesn't really tell us that much. I mean, I would note that, the report that we heard about earlier suggested that there were 29 University of Florida students or DEI employees who were 29 people who worked in DEI at the University of Florida. Well, 13 people got fired. It's hard to sometimes put your finger on this, right?
Thank you.
How many people actually?
Thank you. And as I yield back, I just want to say I wish we had time to talk with Dr. Greene about your interesting research about taking students on field trips to museums, which I think would be much more constructive than this conversation. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize my friend from Wisconsin, Ms. Kaufman.
Yeah, Dr. I can't read your name. Goldfarb? Okay. I have heard two physicians tell me that they feel American medicine peaked out about 7 years ago because of this, in part because of the issues we're talking about today. Do you think that is true? Are we seeing a decline in the quality of medicine?
Thank you for the question. You know, I think what we're definitely seeing is a dramatic change in the character of medical education, which if it hasn't played out yet in demonstrating a change in the quality of healthcare, it will in the very, very near future. And I think, I think the issue is to make sure that we have the highest quality medical workforce that we possibly can have.
And that's no longer what we're emphasizing. Did you say that there is an ideology out there that it's important that people of Asian ancestry have Asian doctors and Native American ancestry have Native American doctors, and that is superior?
Yes, thank you for the question. This is the concept of racial concordance. And what this is really all about is the fact that there are real healthcare disparities in healthcare outcomes. And because of this, medicine, like any field that's enlightened, would seek to improve those kinds of disparities in outcomes. That is not a solution to the problem of disparities, because that's not the basis of healthcare disparities. And Dr. Greene here next to me has conducted a study that's clearly shown that racial concordance, there's no evidence in the medical literature that
I would
benefits
think not.
patients.
I want to read, and I'm sorry for someone who's talking over you, but don't give us 5 minutes. So in other words, there's an ideology that says if I'm a Native American, I'd rather have a doctor who maybe got 30 or 40 points lower on the MCATs, but who was a Native American, rather than an Asian doctor who did superior on the MCATs, because is that what that ideology lives to?
Yes, that's basically the
You have to be really a sicko to really think that's the way we should operate our medical schools. That we would want a doctor who hasn't done it performed as well, but just because of racial reasons. I'd like to meet that person who would say, I'd rather have somebody with low MCATs treat me because they look like me. I mean, I assume there are a couple people out there like that, but that's just almost beyond belief. Next question. Dr. Smith, there is and I want you to comment on this, there's an ideology here in that what you bring to a job, today we happen to be talking about medical school or education, but it could be anywhere, is colored by where your ancestors come from, right? So if some guy's got a grandmother who was born in Norway and somebody else has a grandmother that was born in Honduras, that colors their world of view, or they'll be different, better or worse, or bring something different to the engineering firm or whatnot. What do you think about this idea that the way you think is determined by ancestors who you may never have met? Maybe the grandmother died before I was born, but still these DEI professionals want to break you out and say you're different.
DEI, undergirded by critical social justice, skirts individuality. It's all about group consciousness. Group consciousness is necessary for this ideology, because if we have individuals, then we have individual people with their own individual lives and histories that cannot be predetermined based on their skin color. So we have to look at somebody as a member of a group and not an individual. That's necessary for this to work. So with your example, it's about race. With other examples, it's about sexual orientation. With other examples, it's about ability. But everybody is a group member and not an individual, and that's the issue.
Right. You must hang around with these people or talk to them. What goes on in their mind? How, for example, they think somebody who's spent their whole life in the United States but had a grandmother from Honduras thinks differently, apparently, than, and I don't know what they do with people who are adopted, because they might not even know where they're from. I guess it's purely a genetic thing. But how do they justify that? Do they really believe that if I have a grandmother from Honduras, I view the whole world differently? Somebody who I've never met, Sorry.
Yes.
Just quick answer.
Okay. It's a fabricated ideology based on standpoint epistemology, meaning that based on your race and your experience, you see the world differently than somebody else, even about objective reality.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize my friend Ledger Fernandez from New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. So once again, we are here, and the Education Committee is looking backwards, not forwards. They're stoking the fear and divisiveness of the culture wars. Thankfully, we just saw the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals with 2 Trump appointees strike down Ron DeSantis' so-called Stop Woke Act. These attacks against diversity are looking back to a time when white males dominated our institutions. We simply can't go back. We need our institutions to reflect the strength of our country. Diversity is our strength and can and should be celebrated. To those who think our nation has moved beyond to a colorblind society, I'm going to quote Kevin McCarthy, Speaker Kevin McCarthy at the time, who said, no, not at the time, but who said in regard to the 2019 State of the Union, I look over at the Democrats and they stand up. They look like America. We stand up, we look like the most restrictive country club in America, close quote. Check out the State of the Union tonight and see if things have changed. My own story as the first Latina to represent my district is indeed a DEI story. As a Latina from rural New Mexico at a small school that didn't have AP classes or normally sends students to the Ivy Leagues, I was recruited to attend Yale by someone who saw my promise and my SAT scores. Besides the few Latinos and Black students similarly recruited to diversify the student body, it was generally wealthy, white, and still mostly male. In my study spot in the library, I received notes telling me that I did not belong there. If I ate lunch with my Latino and Black classmates, my white classmates would complain about the mere fact that we were eating together. The university did not at that time provide the range of DEI programs that so many students benefit from today. I worked hard to create opportunities for my classmates to learn more about my community and broaden their perspectives. I invited Cesar Chavez to speak on campus and repacked the halls. And it was white students who were there with the Latinos. They wanted to know more about what was happening with the farm workers, what was happening in my Latino communities. Research shows that all students perform better when classrooms are more diverse. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article, Report, STEM Classes with Racial Socioeconomic Representation Boost Student GPA.
No objections.
Dr. Murphy, I really want to thank you for your emphasis on facts and research, not just anecdote, although I told my anecdote. I want to thank you for your emphasis on respect and opportunity and dignity. But could you share with us how DEI initiatives actually strengthen student bodies rather than divide them?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that, again, that feeling that research shows, but everyone's human experience shows as well, where when you are in a place where you feel respected and as good as everybody else, you perform at a higher level. When we're looking at highly selective colleges, the colleges some people now call highly rejective colleges because there's so few students can get into them, a lot of the success that students get from that experience is being around other students, right? Being around students who are not like them, right? And learning about sort of the richer American experience and gaining from those different perspectives. So, in fact, the emphasis on simply inclusion, just that one element there, is a crucial part of how DEI actually drives success, right? Retention and completion onward into a career.
Right, and the idea that we would want our leaders, because if you're going to universities, you're going to be a leader, whether it be in business or here in Congress, wouldn't we want them to be curious about and know more about their diverse communities?
Absolutely. And if you look at private industry, you'll see diversity officers or DEI officers in a huge portion of private industry, right? These are private corporations that are choosing to hire somebody because they're recognizing the value of having somebody essentially there who can make sure that these issues are always at the table, not running the table, but at the table.
Right, and when we all are at the table, we can be more respectful of each other. I think I have 6 seconds left. I will end on that respect and dignity includes all of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd like now to recognize my friend from Indiana, Ms. Brinks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Goldfarb, the Association of American Medical Colleges has called for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in medical education. How does DEI help medical students become better physicians?
Well, I don't think it does, and thank you for that question. Again, the problem that medicine is trying to correct is this problem of disparate outcomes in healthcare. And the question is, what's the basis for it? Rather than decide that it's an ideological problem and that there's bias on the part of physicians treating patients, the real issue is access to care and patients getting access to care and patients accessing care appropriately. But once you decide that the problem is because physicians are biased, then all of this DEI regimen flows from that. And it's very unfortunate because it's wrong and it's wasteful of time, which is one of the arguments that I tried to portray in my testimony, that we're wasting time in medical school teaching more and more about these issues for which physicians have no agency whatsoever. And it also doesn't benefit the communities in whose disparities we're trying to improve. Those communities need better access to care. They don't need the faculty of a medical school going to anti-bias training.
This seems really dangerous. Harvard's medical school diversity statement says, quote, "We celebrate the multiple dimensions of diversity that each member of our community offers, including but not limited to gender identity." Do you think, Doctor, that celebrating gender dysphoria violates the Hippocratic Oath?
You know, I think gender dysphoria and its treatment has been a terrible problem in this country. In the face of European nations that have now all, almost as a block, have decided that so-called gender-affirming care has turned out to be more harmful than beneficial and have restricted it substantially. In this country, it's continued to be advocated at the highest levels of American medicine. And I think my organization has been pushing very hard against children being put through these programs. We make no position about adults. That's not our concern. Our concern is saving children who can't possibly consent to this kind of treatment with irreversible outcomes that will influence the rest of their lives. We feel very much that that should not be part of medical education and shouldn't be part of the medical care of children.
Indeed, would you say that gender mutilation of children violates the Hippocratic Oath?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I would agree. Transgender surgeries and related medical treatments can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Do you think can you talk about the financial incentives to the medical industry to perform those types of surgeries?
Yes, you know, the insurance companies have been paying for this kind of care. The military insurance system has been paying for this sort of care. Our organization has a bill that we're promoting that will help those many children who have decided to detransition and seek medical care for that. And that, unfortunately, there are no billing codes, for example, for that kind of care. So this has become an economic issue as well as a moral and a medical issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, to sum it up, since medical professionals are told not to believe in biological sex, what kind of impact does that have on the medical practice at large?
Well, again, this has been a very contentious and I know very unfortunate area of contention. Our organization, again, focuses very much on the issue about gender care for children. Children cannot possibly understand what they're getting into when they agree to these kinds of treatments. Their parents, unfortunately, have been sort of coerced into this by being told that suicide is the outcome if they don't support their children in their gender transitions. The literature now shows that none of that is correct, and that in fact, these children should be treated with psychological care, and I know there have been hearings in this building before about this. These children need psychotherapy. They do not need surgery.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate what you do. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize my friend from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. I want to focus today on a pernicious form of discrimination that this committee has recently focused on, and that is anti-Semitism. This committee's previous hearings and roundtables have highlighted the fact that anti-Semitism is a major problem on college campuses and, frankly, across the country. And just last week, we had 9 very brave Jewish students from 9 different universities come forward and describe to us really unbelievable instances of anti-Semitism that are taking place in their schools by students, by faculty, by administrators. And if DEI is the right place to address anti-Semitism, then those DEI programs have been failing the Jewish students. We know from the ADL's findings that while 55% of university students have previously completed DEI training, only 18% of them say they have had any training that is specific to anti-Jewish prejudice. There are lots of reasons for the anti-Semitism that we see rising. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories promote the idea that all Jews are powerful, that they don't need or deserve protection as a minority. Some might not understand, in fact, most don't understand the origins of anti-Semitism or how pervasive it is, or frankly, how unique a form of discrimination it is. Many people do not understand that Jews are a diverse and multiracial community, that there is no one way to look Jewish or practice Judaism or live as a Jewish person. I am concerned, however, that the failure of DEI or universities in general to protect Jewish students is being exploited to denigrate the value of diversity and the value of DEI programs on campuses that are doing the right thing to make minority students feel welcome and included. And I am wondering, in fact, whether DEI needs to be fixed instead of thrown out so that it does make all students, all minorities, feel protected, and that would include Jewish students and minority students and LGBTQ students. So I want to start, Dr. Murphy, with you. Do you believe the DEI programs are capable of including segments to educate students and faculty members about the origins, the long history, and the dangers of anti-Semitism?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, do most DEI programs address anti-Semitism?
I do not have enough knowledge to say. I do not have enough knowledge to say whether or not they do.
Do you know whether there have been any studies to determine whether DEI programs include anti-Semitism?
I am not personally familiar with one.
Because I went on the websites of some of the schools that whose students spoke at our roundtable, and I was unable to find anything in their DEI programs that addressed anti-Semitism. So, Dr. Murphy, is there anything structural about DEI programs that would prevent or impair those programs from addressing anti-Semitism?
To the contrary, right? These programs are intended to respect the rights and dignity of all students and to ensure, typically, to ensure that they are not discriminated based on race, color, religion, disability, national origin. So no, there's nothing structurally in DEI programs. And I guess I do want to return to the idea of, like, we need to be careful about talking about DEI as if it's this monolithic structure. It isn't.
And so it seems that if we had some structure and some standards for what DEI programs included, that might be a better use of DEI?
I think addressing institutions that are failing on this front is a very important task to take on.
Thank you. I have found throughout my education and my career that I can learn an enormous amount from colleagues whose backgrounds and life experiences are different from my own. And what I learn has impacted the way I behave, the way I make decisions in my own life and in the work I do. And so I just like to ask Dr. Greene, because you address this issue as well, do you believe that DEI programs properly done could address anti-Semitism?
I think thank you for the question, and thank you for your statements about the problems with anti-Semitism and the neglect of Jews in DEI bureaucracies. But this is not an accident. It's a feature of the worldview of DEI bureaucracies. Because they're informed by the belief that people should be treated as members of groups and treated differently by their group membership based on oppressor or oppressed status, that inevitably puts Jews in contest for potentially being considered oppressed. And I think it's bad for Jews to enter the oppression Olympics and attempt to be served by DEI bureaucracies.
Sadly, my time has expired and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'd like now to recognize my friend from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Dr. Murphy said a few moments ago. He said it's hard to say why DEI offices exist. I certainly agree with that. And yet, in his 2021 report, Diversity University, DEI Bloat in the Academy, Dr. Greene found that large public universities average about 45 DEI personnel, ranging from Stanford University with 80, Virginia Tech with 83, Ohio State with 94, University of Virginia in my district 94, and then the biggest one that I noted, Michigan, University of Michigan with 163. So Dr. Greene, in your testimony, you cite the millions of dollars that various universities spend on DEI offices, and you state that there is indeed, quote, nothing to show for these expenditures. Can you elaborate on that, what you mean by that there's nothing to show for these expenditures?
Sure. So we've heard claims that DEI is meant to make students feel included, improve retention and graduation, but we haven't heard any evidence of that. And there's a reason for it. I don't believe that evidence exists. And in fact, the systematic evidence that I've collected is that that campus climate is no better on campuses, and in fact is worse, according to student surveys, at universities with larger DEI bureaucracies, and anti-Semitism is associated with DEI bureaucracies as well. So millions of dollars are being spent, and it's actually exacerbating group tension, not helping.
Yeah, so if you had let's say an average of 100 on a college campus, just for round numbers, and the average cost, full benefit package, $200,000, that's $20 million a year. Where's all that money? You don't find any evidence that's actually benefiting in any measurable way, is what you're saying. But go ahead.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, but DEI offices do serve to divide, discriminate, and differentiate how people are treated based on race. And this is 60 years after the Civil Rights Act, 57 years after the first black Supreme Court justice, with two others who followed behind are still in the court today, 16 years after our country elected the first black president, and now 3 years after our nation elected our first minority vice president. But as you noted, the DEI jobs on college campuses are not low-paying jobs, are they? Matter of fact, at the University of Virginia in my district, the vice president for DEI and community partnerships makes $340,000. At University of Virginia, $340,000, double that of a member of Congress, and I realize most people think that we're overpaid, but it's also double the average of a university professor at UVA, which is about $175,000. Is there any way you could justify that or explain why we would pay the head of DEI double what we pay a college professor at UVA or a school like that?
No, I don't think there's any justification for it. This is money being wasted, and in fact, money that's hurting the legitimate purposes of higher education.
And you've already noted that you've seen no measurable performance metrics that demonstrate the difference that it's making, other than perhaps the jobs program for the individuals that are in those DEI offices.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So again, DEI offices do create and perpetuate high-paying job opportunities with little in the way of meaningful performance measurements, other than to continue to perpetuate racial division for woke liberals who believe our country's irretrievably and systemically racist. And I would again argue that the jobs program for these individuals does not justify their existence. To make matters worse, by the way, on who is hired into these jobs, The Assistant VP for Equity and Inclusion Excellence at, again, University of Virginia, my district, was recently seen on a video discussing how people, including white people, are, quote, dying of whiteness and dying prematurely in their 20s. Clearly, that sentiment, I guess, justifies her exorbitant salary. But thankfully, Mr. Chairman, we have a Supreme Court that is beginning to dismantle the mythical need to continue to treat people differently based on race, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize my friend from Georgia, Ms. McCabe.
Thank
Beth,
you,
I'm sorry.
Chairman Owens and Ranking Member Wilson. And I've read your testimonies today, so thank you so much to our witnesses. 5 months to the day of the deadliest attack on Jewish civilians since the Holocaust, Jewish students around the country and across the world continue to face hate and vitriol and are somehow being considered collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel, a country they may have never lived in or possibly even visited. This is textbook anti-Semitism, and it simply can't be allowed to continue unchallenged or at our universities. However, it is wrong to use the very real threat of anti-Semitism as a political tool to oppose policies that you simply don't agree with. It is disappointing to see the majority today attempt to use the very real pain that is caused by this conflict and the scourge of anti-Semitism as a vehicle to push an extreme political agenda that is determined to erase any mention of the words diversity or equity on campus. Instead of dismantling these programs, we should commit ourselves to improving them, to ensuring that every student feels welcome on campus and that all of the stories that we've heard from these students are being treated with the care and the respect and the dignity that they deserve. But that cannot come at the cost of dragging us backwards and undoing the important progress that we've made as a nation. The fact of the matter is that Black Americans and students of color have historically been denied access to universities despite being just as qualified and willing to learn as their white peers. As much as my colleagues would like to say otherwise, this is the reality. And it's one that occurred relatively recently during my lifetime and many other members of this committee's lifetimes as well. One whose impact cannot simply be forgotten about or corrected overnight. It is the reality for people that look like me every single day, and the reality that continues to spur the need for policies like this in the very first place. My Republican colleagues can't have it both ways. You can't claim to be protecting free speech and diversity of thought while simultaneously trying to deny our history, which is the history of America, and it is the inclusive history of America, and dismiss the stories that make us who we are as a nation. Stories like my father's, who was the branch president of the NAACP in Illinois at the height of the civil rights movement. This refusal to have difficult conversations, to just sweep what makes you uncomfortable under the rug and act like it isn't there or did not happen, is a disservice to our students and to our nation. It is a disservice to those who lived these realities and to the heroes like my dad and John Lewis and so many countless others who put their lives and reputations on the line to help this country live up to its promise of liberty and justice for not just a few people, but for all people. Dr. Murphy, could you please use the time that we have left to discuss the importance of ensuring that students from groups such as racial and ethnic minority students, the LGBTQ+ students, or first-generation college students have equitable access to colleges and to universities?
It's tremendously important. I mean, we've made great strides. I do not want to to diminish that in any way whatsoever. But the diversity on campuses, particularly more selective campuses, still lags far behind the country. I believe that some Ivy League institutions, if you look at the percentage of Black students on campus now, it's lower than it was in the 1990s. So progress needs to be made there, and an emphasis needs to be put on the importance of diversity on campus, in part because I guess what I'm hearing a lot in the criticism of DEI programs is a viewpoint that I reject wholeheartedly, which is that there's a dearth of talent out there, right? That there just aren't that many talented people, and every single one of the most talented people is going to rise to the top and be seen for their talent. The reality is all of us who have succeeded in life can point to numerous people along the pathway who have lifted us, right? I think DEI helps us keep that in mind, right? To keep in mind who has had the opportunity, who has had the resources, and how that has impacted their experiences.
Thank you so much, and I am out of time.
Thank you. Well, I would like to recognize my good friend from New York, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first would like to associate myself with the comments and concerns of my colleague across the aisle, Representative Manning, particularly in the correlation between anti-Semitism that's rising on our university campuses and the chilling participation of the DEI offices in their failure to look out for all students and often seem to be a facilitator or protector of anti-Semitism as it grows and expands on our campuses. Dr. Goldfarb, are you still at the University of Pennsylvania?
No, I'm retired now, sir.
Was your decision to retire from UPenn related at all to perhaps the reaction of your being outspoken on this topic? Would you say that that created an environment that made retirement a bit more attractive?
Well, it was time to retire. However, I certainly did receive an unfortunate sort of canceling. My name was taken off the website at the University of Pennsylvania. My name was taken out of the history of one of the kidney division, which I was once the co-director. So I did receive the opprobrium of my colleagues over my activities.
And this was because of medical malpractice? I mean, because of something you did wrong in the practice or teaching of medicine?
No, sir. This was because of my political ideas or my general ideas about medicine and healthcare and medical education.
That is disappointing and shocking to hear, and I'm sorry that you had that conclusion to a very distinguished career. You comment pretty broadly about medical schools and the application process. I want to expand that a little bit. Would you say that the effects of DEI, as you described them, the harmful effects of DEI, are limited just to medical school application boards or admission boards? Is there a broader issue, with, maybe it's accreditation, maybe it's, medical associations or other interest groups and professional groups around medicine? Is DEI just on the campus, or does it have a broader impact?
No, certainly it has had a very broad impact. American medicine, for reasons that are peculiar at best, has decided that it's been a profoundly racist activity without evidence really for that. I think this all started in earnest when George Floyd was killed, and it's really blossomed, if you will, since then. And more organizations have taken up this cry that they need to purge themselves of what's been a traditional focus on meritocracy and focus very much on the issue of diversity. Diversity is fine. It's just that we have to worry about patient welfare. That's our main concern as physicians, and not the benefit of the practice of medicine and the benefit of people who practice medicine, but on patients. And unfortunately, that requires focusing on allowing the best and brightest individuals to be the ones who practice medicine.
Have you had other doctors talk to you about your experience, being shown the door, or at least being erased from the history of UPenn? Has it chilled other people in the medical practice and the medical profession from speaking out on this meritocracy or speaking in defense or support of meritocracy? Have you had, you don't have to name names, but have you had private conversations that this has had a ripple effect even for people not brave enough like yourself to speak out?
I don't know how brave I am, but I must say that we have 7,000 members in our organization, and every day we're hearing from individuals who have expressed their concerns about what they've seen happening in medicine, their concerns about the quality of the individuals who are coming into medicine and the quality of education that's going on in medicine. So this is an ongoing, real phenomenon in medicine.
Do you know of anyone that got into medicine because they were more concerned about equity than they were about helping people? Do you find that a common theme? It seems like most doctors I know want to help people, but maybe this has blossomed into another reason to enter the medical profession.
No, I think there's a desire, and it's been an overt desire to train medical students as social workers and to have that aspect of their work. And those issues are very important, but we have social workers who actually perform those tasks, and they are the ones who should be performing those very important tasks, not the physicians who need to focus on the care of the patients and their medical problems.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize my friend from Washington, Ms. Sharp.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Every student deserves a welcoming and supportive learning environment, and that's particularly important for students from backgrounds that have faced decades of exclusionary practices and policies limiting access and the completion of degree programs. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs play a necessary role in fulfilling that promise of a post-secondary education by connecting students with support. But unfortunately, right-wing pundits have targeted these programs over claims that these programs are racist. This misguided discourse has devolved into bills being proposed throughout state houses, and 8 that have become law, seeking to eliminate supporting students who are historically unrepresented or underrepresented on campuses. Dr. Murphy, following the Supreme Court decision to end race-conscious admissions, this diluted thinking found its way into state policies that discouraged institutions from supporting students of color. That includes Missouri, whose Attorney General directed all colleges to immediately stop considering race in scholarships. Is this required by the SCOTUS decision, and how does the Supreme Court decision affect financial aid or other supports that are targeted to students of color?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is incredibly important. So the first thing to say about the majority opinion in SFFA was that the phrase affirmative action, in fact, does not appear in it anywhere. They use race-based admissions. I prefer race-conscious admissions, but that is all they talked about was the admissions process. I mean, if we want to be real sticklers, they really talked about the admissions process at 2 colleges in America. But we have interpreted it as, all right, this certainly does apply to the admissions decision, right, colleges make. And every university in the country has reacted appropriately. Many politicians have not reacted appropriately. The Attorney General of Missouri issued that decision, or issued his essentially direction, in about, I think the number was 27, maybe 29 minutes after the decision came out. I read the entire decision as soon as it came out. It was hundreds of pages. I am not a speed reader, I guess, but within 30 minutes, they were prepared to say that the decision extended to all of these things. There is no mention of financial aid, no mention of recruiting processes, no mention of DEI anywhere in that Supreme Court decision.
Thank you. They clearly overreached. I find it concerning that the race-conscious admissions decision is being misapplied to prevent schools from helping students of color because, as you spoke about, and as my colleague Ms. McBath spoke about, students of color have real challenges. The average percent of students who returned to college in 2022 was 76%, but when you disaggregate it by race, students of color fall below that average. 71% of Latino students, 66% of Black, and 62% of Native American students. And this is not about personal failings for this group of people. It's about lack of access, lack of opportunities. And reducing financial aid opportunities also contributes dramatically to these gaps. Black students, for example, owe an average of 188% more than white students 4 years after graduation. What should be done to hold institutions accountable for withholding support and exacerbating these gaps in admissions?
So I think two things are really important. One is what I think a lot of institutions are doing is overcorrecting and eliminating financial aid programs, which again, the law did not, the decision did not address in any way whatsoever. We are seeing scholarships that are connected to race being eliminated in red and blue states. I think this is a fear of legal complaint. What also has to happen, so schools need better instruction on what the decision said. The other thing I think that we need is we need a lot more transparency in the entirety of the admissions process, right? We need, for the first time, to get disaggregated data on race and ethnicity at every step of the admissions process. This will be important for accountability, but will also be important to, I think, improve practices in higher ed as well.
Yeah, incredibly important. At the University of Washington, for example, we have an array of historically underrepresented groups that have really addressed this issue of gaps. How can institutions use that disaggregated admissions data that you're talking about to improve the impact on underrepresented students?
Yeah, so one good example is that right now we can only see who's enrolled in an institution by race. It's really important to be able to see who applied, right? So that's a recruiting question, and then who also enrolled. That's a yield question. It would be helpful for other institutions to see what's going on, not just at their immediate peers, but across the nation, to find essentially best practices.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Hutchin from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here to testify before us today. I'm especially interested in the testimony provided by Dr. Goldfarb on the impact you've seen at medical schools. As you probably know or may know, Indiana University in my state has the largest medical school in the country. This issue is particularly close to home for me. Dr. Goldfarb, you describe how DEI has caused medical schools to focus on political advocacy instead of healthcare outcomes. Are there specific examples you could give us from your time at UPenn that illustrates that point?
So I'm now out of UPenn for several years, and so I can't really speak to exactly what's going on there, but what we've seen is just around the nation, increasingly detailed kinds of programs, courses in advocacy, for example. I mean, this is one of my favorite topics, is training physicians to be advocates for all of these political activities. And there's no question that the point of this is to create individuals who use the authoritative aspects of being physicians to argue for political causes and political approaches. And our organization has gathered lists, and I have lists here that I can provide you, of multiple kinds of examples of courses, seminars, letters in applications that require students to explain how they're going to implement these kinds of political activities in their careers as medical students and then as physicians.
So I want to focus on a little bit of your comments. You said what had been a traditional approach focused on clinical science and aimed at developing medical leaders was being readied for transformation into a far greater emphasis on community involvement and concern for social issues. You have said that American academic medical centers have been the engines of advances in the treatment and cures of diseases. What will this new emphasis on social issues do to research and science in the treatment and cures of diseases?
Yeah, I think one of the most peculiar and really unfortunate developments in all this has been the idea that diversity in research labs is a requirement for successful performance of scientific research. And this is just absurd, really. What we need in the scientific laboratories are the most qualified, the most creative, the most talented individuals, and it's an incredibly competitive area. The NIH funds something on the order of 15% of the investigator-initiated grants. And to say that labs need to then demonstrate that they're diverse is without real merit, without evidence that that will do anything to improve the scientific quality, and much more likely to reduce the scientific quality because the expenditure of energy, funds, and time in order to create some sort of diverse environment in the laboratory.
Thank you. And a couple of things I want to note, too. You've said medical schools around the country are adopting an approach that seems to echo the curriculum of schools of social work. And in the K through 12 education, in the judiciary, all of these places, we are really, and including in medical academia, we're really trending into an area where, in your own words, physicians have not the agency to address some of these issues. We see social and emotional learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory. You wrote a significant op-ed, Take 2 Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns, and that has turned to some calling you an activist. When you were in medical school, did you ever think you would be considering yourself an activist for advocating for things like rigor in science?
No, this has been surprising to me and certainly to my family and my friends that I've ended up doing this. But, you know, as I said in my testimony, I really care deeply about medicine and about medical care and about the care patients received. I think in my career, I've thought it to be a wonderful experience, and patients were treated wonderfully, irrespective of what they look like. And my great concern is that that's going to change. That's starting to change now, and that's really why I've decided to pursue this course.
And you note finally, too, that there are concerns that you share that this type of political and philosophical theory really will drive division and poison the American experience. And you quote Ibram Kendi saying, past discrimination can only be remedied by present discrimination can only be remedied by future discrimination. I don't want to see us in a world where we are driven by discrimination, and that unfortunately feels like that's the direction the left wants to take us. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to recognize my friend from New York, Ms. Stefani.
Thank you very much, Congressman Owens. Dr. Goldfarb, in our ongoing investigation of higher ed institutions and the increase of anti-Semitism that is on display at Harvard, Penn, MIT, the 3 schools we had here, but beyond that, throughout colleges and universities, one theme that is very concerning to me is the offices of DEI on these college campuses are inherently anti-Semitic. And I'll give you an example from my alma mater, Harvard. Even prior to the October 7th Hamas attacks against Israel and the failure of Harvard's leadership to protect Jewish students on campus, hundreds of Jewish students reached out to Harvard's Office of DEI, raising concerns about the rise of anti-Semitism, and they did not even receive a single response from the Office of DEI. So can you comment? I know that you've watched, as a former dean of Penn's med school, you watch what's happening on that campus, but can you talk to me about how these offices of DEI fuel this increase in anti-Semitism?
Yeah, you know, we've written about it, and Dr. Greene here has written about this quite extensively as well. I think the point is that once you start dealing with this identity politics, once you start thinking about people as members of groups, he's pointed out how Jews suddenly become the oppressor simply because of their prominence in these academic institutions. Once identity politics takes over, then one of the natural consequences of it is divisiveness and antagonism between groups, because now we're putting people into these groups. Yasha Monk has recently written about this in his book, The Identity Trap, and points out, as a man of the left, what a great concern this is for American life. And I think what we're seeing in the anti-Semitism that's really sprung up terribly in the last few months has been the natural outcome of thinking about people as members of a group rather than thinking about people as individuals. And I think in medical school, in colleges and undergraduates, that's what we're seeing. I think these students have decided that are parading and demonstrating this anti-Semitic sentiment. They see the Jewish students as members of a group, not as individuals, not as their friends, not as their co-students, but as members of a group. And once you go down that path, this is the consequence of it. This is why it's so divisive in America.
And Dr. Greene, would you like to answer the question as well?
Sure. I mean, I agree entirely with Dr. Goldfarb's comments, and just say that we've systematically measured this. I mean, in a study we did of 741 DEI officers, we examined their social media, Twitter feeds, and we observed shocking levels of anti-Semitism coming from people with a professional obligation not to do that. It's as if we studied doctors and found that they were smokers, right? It would be not something you'd expect from people in an occupation. And yet, DEI staff are active promoters of anti-Semitism in their social media feeds, and it's not surprising that they also facilitate it on campus.
Thank you. Yield back.
I'd like to recognize the chair of the full committee, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and shedding a lot of light on this very, very important issue. It was recently brought to my attention that all athletic teams at Davidson College, roughly 1/4 of the student body, were mandated to attend a showing of a film entitled, "I'm Not Racist, Am I?" That was followed by an all-afternoon discussion with one of the film's producers. Let's take a look at a part of this film now. If we could stop the clock, it would be helpful.
Is the misuse of power in 3 ways. It hurts and controls people of color. It helps white people. And it's designed to make everyone go along with a racial construct. And which one do you think is most important out of these 3? Of which one was racism set up to do?
Help white people.
Help white people. That's all it is. The fact that it hurts and controls people of color, that's just an effect.
I don't think that racism is only white people being racist against other minorities. I think minorities can be racist against white people too.
We would call that bigotry. We wouldn't call that racism. And we continue to change the idea of who is white, who gets into the club and who doesn't. And you know how we do it? We never define what white is. We just tell you whether you're not. We would also say that it's only white people that could be racist, that are racist, and that people of color cannot be.
So are you saying that all white people are racist?
Yes.
Thank you. We have Davidson's for freedom of thought and discourse to thank for bringing this to light. Dr. Smith, can you provide a quick reaction to what you just saw?
First of all, I want to say that what we just saw there is what I'm talking about when it comes to DEI. I'm sure there are various officers that are doing it right. Too many are doing it wrong, and that's the kind of thing they're doing. The nitpicking between racism and bigotry is absurd. What's more, typically those students aren't allowed to push back. I haven't seen the rest of this, but if they are allowed to push back, if critical inquiry and a true conversation is allowed to take place, then that's one thing. That's not happening. You're not allowed to question these things too much, or else you are considered a bigot. What's more, a lot of these things that they are demonizing are things that are helpful to our students, like individuality and self-reliance and reason and rationality. These things are considered quote-unquote white ways of knowing. This is not good for anyone, especially students of color.
Thank you very much. Dr. Greene, could you provide a quick reaction to this film discussion?
I think it captures perfectly the DEI worldview that divides people into different groups, treats them differently based on group identity, and believes that all whites are racist and no non-whites can be racist. These aren't just absurd, they're actual natural outgrowths of the DEI worldview that informs most of the DEI movement and that we see in the professional standards issued by the National Association of Diversity Officers.
Dr. Goldfarb, you mentioned in your testimony that Do No Harm found a similar situation in which UCLA's medical school required students to segregate by race. Have you spoken with some of these students, and how is UCLA responding?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Congresswoman. Yeah, that went on at UCLA, putting students into different groups. There were white students and somewhat brown students and black students. Each group was different. And it's unclear whether it's still going on, but I've spoken recently to faculty members there who say there's absolutely no regret on the part of the institution about doing that, and feeling like the fact that this occurred and the views that we had about it were represented, quote, misinformation. So it's still, and it's been advocated in the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine to occur throughout medical education as a way of giving people the chance to have that kind of discussion that we just saw on the screen go on and create divisiveness amongst the various groups.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this material, again, was brought to us from Davidson's for Freedom of Thought and Discourse, and a former member of this body and former governor of North Carolina, James G. Martin, has written an editorial about this, and I would like to submit that editorial for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize my friend from California, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been a few months now since this committee held a hearing with several university presidents that shocked the conscience of the country and opened many people's eyes to just how warped much of higher education in this country has become. And for me, one of the most jarring moments of that hearing was when President Claudine Gay of Harvard, now rightfully former president, refused to answer time and time again whether she could assure the parents of a Jewish student or a prospective Jewish student that their child would feel safe and welcome on her campus. She refused repeatedly to even answer the question, which just demonstrated very clearly that she did not understand the gravity of what was occurring on that campus. Now, here today, we've had folks on both sides of the dais, talk about how DEI bureaucracies have been indifferent and failed to adequately respond to the crisis of anti-Semitism on campus. But really, the issue goes deeper than that. It's that these very bureaucracies have, in many ways, are at the root of the problem. And so, Dr. Greene, you have some actual evidence demonstrating that, where you've used social media to document how they are, in fact, in many ways, the source of the problem. Could you just give us those statistics again?
Sure. So we analyzed the Twitter feeds of 741 DEI staff. These were the DEI staff that we identified in our study of the 65 universities in the Power 5 athletic conferences. And what we found was that the DEI staff were obsessed with the state of Israel. 96% were critical of the state of Israel, while by comparison, they spoke about China 1/3 as often, even though China's a much bigger country. This was during the pandemic when China was in the news, but they weren't that interested in China, and they were 62% favorable towards China. And so it crosses the line into anti-Semitism because of the double standard and the obsessive criticism, and because of the vitriolic language that we found. So one could be critical of the state of Israel without crossing that line, but it's very clear they did, and did repeatedly, and this was endemic in DEI staff.
So the very people that are hired to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, to make students feel safe and welcome, are in fact using their social media accounts to promote anti-Semitism. It's really goes to show you that these have become Orwellian institutions in the truest sense of that term. And when you think about what it tells us about the broader culture of our universities, I mean, our universities are supposed to be promoting progress, not in a partisan sense, but to be at the leading edge of new ideas. And here they are investing in these bureaucracies, tens of millions of dollars, that are leading a 21st century American resurgence of one of the world's oldest and most retrograde prejudices, which was at the root of the greatest crime in the history of the world. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how has this been allowed to happen? And it's happening alongside many other things happening at universities, where they're rejecting the very premise of the Enlightenment. They're saying we shouldn't have free speech anymore. We shouldn't allow the free exchange of ideas. We shouldn't have academic freedom. We should reject the very idea of merit. And so my question for you, Dr. Greene, or for anyone, is how did this happen? How did our universities get to this point? And it's not just limited to universities, because for better or worse, university culture tends to, incubate changes in broader society. And so we've seen a lot of things that started at universities have now become problems more broadly in American life. How did we get to this point, and how do we go about fixing it to get universities back to their core purpose?
So thanks for the question. I'll answer quickly because I want to leave time for others who, this is kind of a warmed over Marxism that made its way into our institutions. That's basically what it is. Good thinking liberals and institutions opened the door to these Marxists who came in and then closed the door behind them, and now they're purging out the liberals. We have to dismantle DEI. We have to starve universities of funds that fuel this nonsense. Those would be the first things I'd recommend. But I think Dr. Smith and Dr. Goldfarb would have useful things to add as well.
First of all, we need to audit these DEI programs, and not just the offices, but faculty as well, who are abiding by this ideology. We need people to see what's going on. And if people deny being audited, that should be a sign that there's something they're hiding. My time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize my friend from Virginia, Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Murphy, you've alluded to the fact that a substantial portion of your education at a four-year college experience occurs outside of the classroom. Can you remind us what life lessons are learned in a diverse campus and the value of a diverse education on a diverse campus that cannot be learned on a non-diverse campus?
Yeah, I mean, when I think all of us who went to a four-year college think back, we sometimes remember classes that we took, but more often we remember the people that we lived with, the meals that we had, the conversations. And all of that stuff is an incredibly important part of that experience. For many people in America, which is unfortunately still highly segregated, both by race and by income, a college campus will be the most diverse place they've ever experienced in their life. They will get to meet people from different income brackets, from different races, from different religions, and indeed, different ideologies, right? That experience is incredibly valuable, both because it enriches one's thinking, it challenges people, and then there is also the more practical issue of when you leave that campus, you're very often going to end up in a workplace where you will encounter, again, different levels of diversity, different kinds of diversity, which is why the value of these programs are so important, and especially in the front of faculty hiring as well. The least diverse place on most colleges' campuses is, in fact, the faculty, right? And so keeping that in mind, recognizing, once again, talent is everywhere, opportunity is not, also enriches that student's experience.
Thank you. Dr. Greene, you talked about merit. If you can show that standardized tests have a racially discriminatory impact, We know that legacy obviously discriminates in favor of college graduates. We're measuring achievement based on where people, after people have gone to different kinds of public schools. It's known now that the schools are as segregated now as they were in the late 1960s, and with segregated schools, opportunities are different. How is, if you're subjected to that, why wouldn't you want to offset the discriminatory impact with affirmative action?
So I think the Supreme Court, thank you for the question. I think the Supreme Court, in its recent decision, decided that universities could not consider race as a preference for admission. It didn't speak to other criteria that could be considered.
If you can show a racially discriminatory pattern, racially discriminatory impact, if you can't just do it with affirmative action on one hand, why should you be able to use those factors on the other?
Well, thanks for the follow-up. I think universities have to figure out the best ways that they can ascertain the qualifications of people for admission to their institutions, and I'm not here to testify about the best way that they're supposed to do that. I'm just here to testify that they shouldn't be discriminating on the basis of race, and they shouldn't be constructing bureaucracies that further discrimination on the basis of race.
It seems to me people are a little blasé about racial discrimination on the one hand, but if you want to compensate for it, people get all upset. Dr. Goldfarb, you're aware that there's a disproportionate incidence of maternal deaths amongst black women. What can you do to address that without involving race?
Thank you very much for that question. You know, the University of Pennsylvania, I've been very proud of one thing that they've done lately is to tackle this directly. The chairman of OBGYN there is a woman named Elizabeth Howell, who's made her career studying this issue of black mortality, maternal mortality. And what they've done is two things to prove my point that the whole issue is better access.
Well, even controlling for access to health care, education, and everything else, there is still a disparity. And how do you address that without involving discussion about race?
But it's not controlling for seeking out health care. It's not controlling for having health care delivered to you. So if I may say, two programs that they put in place. One is they created teams that were focused on any hemorrhage that might occur during the time of delivery, and this improved mortality across the board, including in white women who were also dying because of mortality during delivery. The second thing they did was to supply telehealth measures in order that blood pressure would be followed up after delivery, and they've reduced maternal mortality by 30% in that example. Black women have a 40% less frequency of getting first trimester prenatal care, and therefore that deficiency is an important part of the increased maternal mortality because the deaths occur due to severe hypertension that occurs at the time of delivery. So I think the literature on this is very complex. What's considered maternal mortality involves something up to 6 weeks after delivery as well. There are a lot of social issues involved here, but the issue that I have focused on is it's not because the women are being mistreated when they show up to have their babies. And I think it's black women are now quite terrified to come in and deliver their babies in hospitals because they've been told that this kind of bias is going on, and it's just not correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Allow now to recognize for closing remarks, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to your witnesses to the witnesses for the testimony. I want to note that this is the 59th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when civil rights protesters, led in part by then recent college graduate, our former colleague and friend, the late great John Lewis, who bared the scars of that day for his whole life. I just want to note that, and I'm very grateful that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 have laid the groundwork to create campuses that are more reflective of our society. However, as we heard today, and as we know, discrimination still permeates within the intersections of our society and on college campuses. Students of various religious affiliations, socioeconomic statuses, sexual orientations, race, and even disability are subject to discriminating behavior. So I'm disappointed that instead of having a productive conversation about how we address the root causes of inequality that students can face on college campuses, committee Republicans use this time to target campus DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We should be working together to ensure that students are safe and feel safe and welcome when they're on campuses. And unfortunately, this hearing has not advanced that goal. Democrats will continue to support and defend programs that protect students and educators from all forms of discrimination, harassment, and violence on campus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you again. I'd just like to, first of all, enter into the record, without objection, enter the record of letter to support BNI, and an article by Danielle Allen entitled How to Regain Mutual Respect on College Campuses. Thank you so much. As I kind of wrap up my thoughts here. Earlier, there was a comment about admissions and the low admissions since the 1990s of black students into college. Let me give you a novel suggestion. Let's start teaching our kids earlier how to read, write, and add. That might be a good start. That way that they don't have to worry about affirmative action, they can get there through meritocracy. Second thing is, how about we start thinking that blacks cannot compete intellectually with everybody else? It's called meritocracy, which I grew up with, very proud to say I grew up with, and we win when we put the work and effort in. And the last thing is that we just need to make sure we are now looking at the potential of all our kids, regardless of their color, race, and creed. I think one of the smartest strategies that the Marxist ideology did, and I appreciate your comment, I think it was spot on. It's an ideology that used really good people, good liberals with good intentions. They hide behind these good folks and do damaging bad things. Then we point them out, they say, no, you're talking about good liberals. No, we're talking about Marxists, okay? They don't make that point. But they're really good at understanding how to control the language. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, you would think is a really good thing, unless you think about diversity that excludes Jews, black conservatives, and white, straight male Christians. They're not included into this little bubble that the Marxists put together. They've taken a good word of equality and changed it to equity. Equality says, I just want the opportunity. Give me a chance. I'll run harder, I'll work hard, I will prove myself to gain your respect. Equity is, no, you come with the right color, you come with the right ideology, and you got the job. And inclusion. Well, let's look at our colleges. Harvard University now has a black graduation class, a Hispanic graduation class, and a gay Hispanic class. Go to MIT, you have a black-only dorm. Guess who's not going to be invited in that dorm? Jews, whites, and black conservatives. This is the most divisive concept that we've ever seen, and it is truly a cancer. This is something that destroys everything that builds our foundation of a country, of life, living in pursuit of happiness, and looking at each other from inside out, not outside in. I want to thank my great state of Utah. I tell you, I'm just so proud of the legislators we have there. We're very innovative. We collaborate very well. We believe in fairness. And just recently, we have a couple of my good friends, Kate Hall and Keith Grover, who introduced legislation to ban DEI from our educational systems. It now prohibits discrimination, period. It protects Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It eliminates diversity statements. It creates success centers for all of our students, not just of a particular color. I'm going to kind of wrap up with this one statement. I read this, Dr. Smith, and I just have to respond, I think, and kind of finish up with this one. It's regarding the way that our black students and youth are being addressed. I've been challenged by white and black people alike when I express a parent idea that is we should have more faith in the agency of our minority students, especially black minority students, who seem to be downtrodden poster children for victimhood. This lack of confidence in these children is called empathy. This lack of optimism in succeeding in life is called empowerment. The dismissal of valuable skills that would better ensure success in life is called social justice. And anything that could possibly instill a positive outlook, self-awareness, emotional self-control, delayed gratification, achievement orientation, and adaptation is called white supremacy, with a big hug. Whenever I hear educators advocating such interpretations of higher education, I always say to myself, thank God these were not teachers when I grew up. I want to echo that, thank God. I grew up at a time of segregation, but my community believed in its kids. We believed in meritocracy. We did not teach foolishness. We did not teach to judge each other from outside in instead of inside out. Thank God for that. And I want to thank God for every one of you guys who are engaged in this conversation. We might not agree on everything, but we'll talk about the right topic. What do we do to make sure our kids land in a better spot than we did, like every generation has done before us? Not feeling angry, bigots, discouraged. Let's leave our country and our kids with a greater vision of our country and what we can accomplish. So we can do that, but make sure our education is put in the right place. And this is a great start. So thank you so much. I appreciate your efforts. I appreciate all the comments that's come to us. And I would like again to thank our witness for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. Without objections, there's no further business, and this subcommittee is now stand adjourned.
Thank you.